Tonight we're going to be talking about Angular, the new AngularJS. If you're not familiar with the difference between Angular and AngularJS, Matt Gardner here will be going over the differences and some of the new features that we have with Angular. Kate, do you want to? So Kate's got a small announcement about a survey, but I'll let her give you the details.
Okay, fine. So we have been talking as a team about all the things that we could do to potentially improve the meetups. Are now called hack nights. One of the things we've been talking about is a name change because we don't really have hack nights anymore. But we're asking all of you to take a quick survey when you have a chance. I'm going to keep it open for the next 2 weeks. It's also posted on the meetup page in the discussion section, but I'm going to post this up on the door if you want to take a picture of it. It basically talks about, the content, the accessibility, what we provide and how we could do better. So it would be really great if y'all could take this. Thank you.
Ready? Yep. All right, back to Gardner.
Hello everyone, today I'm going to be talking about the framework Angular, but before I begin, I'd like to talk a little bit about myself. Hi, my name is Matthew Gardner. I'm a front-end developer currently at Kenzan, and I've been here for about 4 years now. But in my free time, I like to play the guitar and listen to music, and with my experience with Angular, I've been playing around with it since it was in its release candidate stage. And some apps I created is I created a website for my mom when she was running for town council using Angular version 2. And currently I've been working with Angular version 6, and I've been creating an app using the Spotify API. So a little bit about Kenzan. Kenzan is a full consultant service firm which deals with architecture, front-end and back-end development, business analysis, and dev test. They also have cloud virtual experts and enablers who work with AWS, Netflix Stack, Kubernetes, ISTO, enterprise architecture, and beyond. And finally, we have DevOps leadership who work with platform builds, continuous delivery, and scalable resourcing. Now, some of the topics that we're going to cover today is the differences between Angular and AngularJS. What is Angular? The core concepts of Angular, major changes from Angular version 2 to version 6, lifecycle methods of Angular, a brief overview of TypeScript, a brief overview of RxJS, a configuration of Angular, the Angular CLI, and what is next for Angular, and then finally demos of the 2 apps that I have been working on.
So we're going to hear
No. Now let's dive into some of the some of the differences between Angular and AngularJS. So in this example, this is a difference between two-way data binding in Angular and AngularJS. So in AngularJS, you would first have to initialize your app as a module, and then you would add a controller to your app. In this case, we're dealing with, you have to use the scope to change the value of first name to John to be initialized, and then in your template itself, you have the ng model of first name, which is used for two-way data binding in AngularJS, and then finally in the header we are displaying that value that you type in the input field as first name. Now for the difference in Angular, we're able to use a class and then use an add component decorator where we have a selector to use it in any of the templates in the framework. And then finally we have the template property, which you are able to use backticks for multiple lines to define your template, or you can specify a HTML path. Now in this example, I'm using ng model with the variable name, which is on the input field, and then in the class itself, I'm creating a public variable called name of type string, which is part of TypeScript, which I'll go over in a future slide. And then in the constructor, I initialize this variable name to John. Now some of the differences between services in Angular and AngularJS is that in AngularJS, you would first have to, again, initialize your app, and then you would add a controller to it. This time we're using scope and location to get the current browser location to set as my URL variable. Now in the template, it just simply displays that my URL property. Now on the difference in Angular, we just use a class with the injectable decorator, and added in version 6, we now use provided in to make it a global instance. And then in the class itself, in this case, I'm just using the method called test, which just takes in a name and then simply just prints out hello name. Now in the component, we're able to just inject this service directly into the constructor, and then finally we can just use this service in the methods inside of anywhere else in this class. Moving on to differences between components in both of the frameworks is we have then again initialized the app, but this time we would add a component to this app, and for the template we are simply just listing a list of phones with a name and a snippet about them, and then in the controller itself we're just initializing the data for the phones. Now in Angular, again, we are just using a class, but at this time we're using an add component decorator, and then in the template, again, we're just listing a list of phones with a name and a snippet. But in the class itself, we have the public variable phones, which we can set as an array of objects for its type, and then in the constructor, we're just listing or initializing the phones variable. Now, does anyone have any questions before I move on?
Yeah, I do. New Angular is a lot like React. Okay. Is it relying on JavaScript ES6? Thank you. Does Angular rely on ECMAScript 6 ES6 the way React does?
Yes.
Or it's just JavaScript? Okay.
It's ES6 with TypeScript and then the Angular framework as well. It's all built into the framework.
So does Angular syntax in there too?
There's some Angular syntax as well.
And Angular, well, also syntax, but like Angular script?
I don't believe so. I think it's just some like directives and properties.
Okay. Cool. Yeah, because it looks so much like React. Borrowed heavily from React. I guess. All right, thank you.
Yep. So now let's move on to what is Angular. Angular is a completely rewritten framework that is based on some of the core concepts of AngularJS. But it does not include the concepts of scope or controllers, but instead it uses a hierarchy of components. It also has modularity, the use of TypeScript, which we'll go over in a future slide, and asynchronous template compilation. Now, some of the main features of the Angular framework is it has cross-platform, speed and performance, productivity, and full development story. For cross-platform, we're able to create progressive web apps, which allows the developer to use web platforms to deliver an app-like experience. We're also able to create native mobile apps on devices such as Apple or Android. And finally, we're able to create desktop apps on platforms such as Mac, Windows, or Linux. For speed and performance, Angular offers code generation, where Angular turns its templates into highly optimized JavaScript code, and you're able to serve your first view of your app on popular servers such as Node.js, PHP, .NET, and other popular servers. And finally, it has code splitting, which Angular now loads faster. Angular apps load faster now with the new component router, where it only loads the code that is required to render. For productivity, you're now able to create UI template views with ease. You also have access to Angular CLI, which is a command line tool that allows you to create your app, create components, serve your app, and finally test your app. It also offers IDE support for code completion, error messaging, and other feedback for popular editors. Finally, with full development story, it offers testing, where it has Karma built into the framework for end-to-end tests, for unit tests. and has protractor for end-to-end tests. Angular also offers an animation library built in where you're able to add simple or complex animations to your app. And finally, accessibility, where you're able to create accessible Angular ARIA-enabled components, developer guides, and a built-in accessibility test infrastructure. Now, before I move on, does anyone have any questions? Now, some of the core concepts of the Angular framework. One of the main focuses is two-way data binding, which is when the properties of the model get updated, it also gets updated in the UI. And when the UI gets updated, the changes get propagated back to the model, which is one of the biggest features in Angular and AngularJS. So now this is an example of two-way data binding in the UI, where if you're typing in the input field, it also gets updated in the UI, and then if you delete the text, it also gets deleted in the UI. Now, this ng template is just an Angular template, and if you're using ng for, or ngIf, or ng-switch, under the hood, it is actually using ng template. And it also has the use of ng container, which you're able to attach structural directive to a section of the page without having to create an extra element to do so. Now this is an example of using ng container and ng template, where in ng container we're just using ngIf, and in this case it's just using the condition true, and if this condition is true, then it will display the local variable hello world, else use the local variable bad world. Now below that we have ng template, which is using the local variable hello world, and then simply inside that we are just displaying hello world. In the bottom template we're just using bad world, which will display bad world. In this case it's just going to always print out hello world. And another side note is that if you're just using ng template alone in your HTML code, it will not get displayed unless you have a condition to display it. Okay, let's move on to guards. Guards is part of the router package in Angular, and it is used to protect your routes. There are 4 different types of guards. We have can activate, which is whether or not the route can be activated or not. We have can activate child, which is whether or not the child route can be activated. We have can deactivate, which is whether or not the route can be deactivated. And finally we have can load, which is whether or not the route can be loaded. So this is just an example of can be deactivated. So first we start on the home route and we move to the auth route. And then when we try to move back to the home route, it pops up with this confirmation window saying, are you sure? If we click cancel, it will stay on the auth route, but if we click if we click OK, it will finally deactivate the route and move back to the home route. Now I can show what the code would look like in this example. Sorry. Just going to increase the web font real quick. Okay, so first I'm going to showcase what routes would look like in Angular. So first we just create this array of routes, and each object is defined as a different route. So each route, you have to have a path and a component. So for the home component, we're simply just displaying an empty string to know the origin route, and we display the component as the home component. And then this last route is just auth, so it will go to /auth, and it has the component protected, and then it adds this other property here for it can be deactivated, and it takes in an array of guards. In this case, we're just using this auth guard. Now looking at the auth guard itself, it's just an injectable service, and implements the method can be deactivated. Now inside this class, we just use the function can deactivate, and simply all we are returning is a window confirmation window. Now in the template itself, it just has two buttons that each switch between both of the routes, and then this router outlet is just used to display the routes that you have defined. And then finally, to import your routes to your module, in your app module file, you just have to import it and then just add it to your imports array. All right, for event emitters can emit custom events synchronously or asynchronously. And when your event is emitted, it returns an observable. When the value, and you're able to get the value from the event emitter by subscribing to the instance. Now this is an example of what an event emitter could look like. In this example, it is just a counter where you're just incrementing and decrementing the value. So when you click on the increment button, it's just emitting a +1 to update the value. If you hit the decrement button, it is just emitting the value -1. Now I will show you what the code looks like in this example. Okay. So with this first file in the app, it's just simply displaying the count, and then it has this counter component that I created, where it is taking in the count itself, and these, you might notice these brackets. This is for variables that you're inputting into a component. And then finally, we have these parentheses over here, where if you're outputting data from a component, you would use the parentheses. And this is a function that is inside of this component. And this display count is just taking whatever is coming back from this component and then using it within this app. Or sorry, within this component, which is just simply taking the count and then updating it for the UI. Now for the counter component, the template is just simply two buttons where if you click on one or the other, or if you click on the increment button, it is simply just passing in a plus string, and then the decrement is just passing in a negative string. Now in the counter component itself, we first define the input of count and the output of count changed as an event emitter. Now in the onChanged method, we're taking the value, and if it's a positive string, we just increment the count, and if it's a negative string, we just decrement. And then finally, we just emit the value back to the count change method, which would come back to this template here, which would get via this event, which would be the final count, which would then get displayed in the UI.
Can you go through those files again just slowly?
Sure.
Thanks. Move next one. Okay. Thank you. There's a lot of inferred connections between things, I guess based on their names.
Yeah, the names might not be the best suited for it.
Okay.
Does anyone else have any questions before I move on to the next section?
What's input and output doing there?
So for input, it is just simply, the input and the output are, if we look back at this previous, it's part of the component. So count is the input that is noted by these brackets. And then count changed is that output, which you guys define as an event emitter, and that's noted by these parentheses. And,
Okay.
and right here, we're just simply defining those values, and then inside we can use them anywhere in the class.
That component finds the HTML
Correct.
And you said that these events could be synchronous, so is it a different kind of event emitter, asynchronous?
They could be either or, so it takes care of it, I believe.
That's magic. Okay.
Any more questions?
Because one looks like just like a regular callback, but an asynchronous one is asking for queuing system involved in background processing. So I'm just curious.
Well, it returns an observable, so you could also subscribe to it. So then so if you have two different components and you emit to that event emitter in another component, you could subscribe, so whenever it gets emitted, it will just get the results. Okay, now let's look at some of the major changes between Angular version 2 and version 6. Now, the Angular framework has continuously updated its framework so it can support the newer versions of TypeScript. It also has the creation of new view engines, it improved the file sizes and application speeds, and finally it moved from System.js to Webpack. And as a side note, the reason they skipped version 3 was because at the time when they were working with version 2, the router engine was in version 3, so they decided to move all the packages to version 4. Now, for some of the major changes in version 6 alone, is it has Angular element support, which allows the developer to create Angular components as web components and be used in any application, even if you don't have access to the Angular framework. It also has service worker support, which was originally introduced in version 5, but in version 6, it includes a bunch of bug fixes and configuration of the navigation URLs within the service workers. Template is now replaced with ng template, which I went over in previous slides. Internationalization now happens at runtime, so you don't have to build one application per locale. They introduced the third rendering engine, Ivy, which is currently in its infancy stage, but you're able to test it in version 6, but it's just off by default. And it should be in a more complete version in the next major release. For ng model changes, values are now omitted after the value is updated from the form control. Angular also now offers Bazel compiler support, which is a tool that automates software builds and tests, and is similar to other tools such as Maven, Ant, Gradle, and Make. It also includes RxJS 6 support, which I'll go over in future slides. It offers tree shaking, which is a new way to define injectable services, or directly in the injectable decorator by adding the provided in to make it a global instance. And finally, it now comes with Webpack version 4. Does anyone have any questions before I move on? Sure.
How recent is version 6?
I think it came out a couple of months ago. I'm not 100% sure. I can find that out for you though.
And also, is everything from version 2 on, or is version 6, is it backwards compatible within, not AngularJS, but?
I believe it is. I think most of it was just updates to some of the packages along the way and fixing bugs. Any more questions? Now for the lifecycle methods of Angular. We first start with ng on changes, which gets called when Angular sets the data-bound input properties. Then we move on to ng on init, which is called after Angular first displays those data-bound input properties. And then it goes into ng do check, which acts and detects the changes that Angular wouldn't normally do on its own. And then we move on to ng after content init, which is called after the component's view is ready. Next, we have ng after content checked, which is called after Angular checks the content that is projected onto the view. And we have ng after view init, which is called after the component and the child views are initialized. and then it moves on to ng after view checked, which is after the component and the child views are checked. And finally, we have ng on destroy, which is called called right before Angular destroys the component or the directive. Now, does anyone have any questions about the lifecycle methods? Now let's look at an overview of what TypeScript is, which was developed by Microsoft and is a superset version of JavaScript that compiles down into plain JavaScript and allows the developer to add types to their variables, such as dividing a variable to be of type string, boolean, number, object, or an array. Now, this is an example of a simple function using TypeScript. In this function, it has the name of greeting, which we're passing the variable person, which is of type string, and then we are simply just returning hello with that person's name. For the good example, I'm passing the string Matt, which will just return hello Matt. But in the bad example, I'm passing the object name with the type string. And you might be able to see there's red squiggly lines underneath this input, which the compiler does not like because you're trying to pass in an object when the variable is defined as a string. Now, does anyone have any questions about TypeScript before I move on? Sure.
Do the types make it faster, or is it just for like syntax checking?
I don't think it's for faster, it's more for syntax checking. So you're able to be more strict with your app and make sure you don't have some of those bugs where you're setting a variable and then later down the road you're changing it to like a string or something like that, where you can do in normal JavaScript.
It also allows you to catch it at compile time instead of runtime.
Okay.
These errors happen before the app actually builds and transpiles down to JavaScript.
So it's making it fully statically typed JavaScript. Is it optional? Could you make it dynamically typed, like assign a variable to a string and make it further down if you want to?
Yeah, I believe so.
Okay.
Owen, do you know?
Yeah, there's the safety hack where you can, in either of the examples where it says person colon, you can use the keyword any.
Okay.
Get out of it that way. TypeScript has a mechanism where you can gradually add it to different files. So if you're, like say, migrating an app from JavaScript to TypeScript, you can kind of compile that file correctly.
That's
There's a
cool.
lot of tweaks for how strict you want the compiler to be.
Is the type checking get improved in the transpile JavaScript? Like what happens if you pass the wrong type parameter?
Once it compiles down, it will just throw out an error message in your compiler. So it will catch that before it goes into runtime. Any more questions before I move on?
So it doesn't, TypeScript doesn't really pass the JavaScript language in terms of other like looping constructs and modular stuff.
I don't believe so. I believe it just kind of wraps around JavaScript, where it just allows you, it's just like a step up where it allows you to just add types to different variables.
That's good, actually. I would just say that it does add a lot of features that you might see in restricted type languages. One of my favorite features of TypeScript is the ability to create an interface. So you can create your own custom type, and you can define a person as an object with a name, first name that's a string, last name that's a string, phone number that's a digit. And then the type could be, I user instead of string, and then you have to say, like, for this create user call ID user object that is these three properties and these three types. There's a lot more, but like interface is probably the most relatable. Thank you.
Moving on to an overview of RxJS. So RxJS is a reactive extensions for JavaScript and allows you to work with asynchronous data streams. Now we can break that down into a more manageable size, where we'll start with asynchronous, where which is when you call a function that is notified with a callback when the results are available. Then we have data, which is information, which could be strings, numbers, or objects. And finally, we have streams, which is a sequence of data that are made available over time. And you can represent these asynchronous data streams using observable sequences. Now let's look at some examples of observables. So in this first example, I have this constant called greeting, where I'm just creating a simple observable, and I'm just adding hello and then world. And then when I subscribe to the greeting, it's just printing out hello world on 2 separate lines. Now in this next example, I take in an array of numbers 1 through 6, and then I'm using the RxJS filter operator to only filter out all of the even numbers from that array. And then finally, from the results left, I'm subscribing, and then I just print out them, and then just all the even numbers. In this last example, it is similar to my previous example, except as it is printing out all of the odd numbers. Now, does anyone have any questions about RxJS before I move on? Okay, let's talk briefly about Angular configuration. So if you create an app using the Angular CLI, you might notice you have an Angular JSON file. And this is the configuration file for the framework, where you're allowed to add third-party scripts, styles, and assets, as well as briefly mess with the testing and the linting of the framework. Now, does anyone have any questions before I move on?
Yeah. What kind of testing can you use Angular?
I know it comes with Karma for unit tests and Protractor for end-to-end tests, but you might be able, I'm not 100% sure if you can, but you might be able to, you should be able to use different.
Mocha and Jasmine.
Yeah, you should be able to use Mocha or Jasmine.
Okay, so basically anything you can test in JavaScript.
Right.
You can test it there.
Now let's talk about the Angular CLI, which is a command line tool interface that scaffolds and builds Angular apps, which can be used to create an Angular app, component, service, guards, pipes, and more. Now before you can actually start using the Angular CLI, you have to install it globally with npm. And once you have it installed, you can then use it by using ng-new with the app name, ng component, and then component name, or you could specify a path as well, and then you can create service, guards, pipes, and then more. Now this is just an example of what some of the output would be for when you're creating a new app. It creates all the components, the directory, and then finally it installs all the npm packages. Now this is the example output of if you're using the CLI to create a pipe. Does anyone have any questions before I move on? Sure.
Why would you want to use CLI to make Angular anything?
Well, I've personally been using it because it allows you to start a new project easily, and you don't have to worry about messing around with Webpack and all those configurations. Where you can just start a new project and then just get on the ground running and just start messing around with Angular.
Okay, but after you create the initial project, I'm going to guess that you don't use it too much afterwards? Or do you still develop it from CLI?
Oh, the CLI is just a scaffolding tool, so it just creates the shell of the new project.
Gotcha.
And then you can, inside that project, you can create new components or services, but then, and you can also, and then Angular itself, you serve your app or build it. And then, yeah, so the CLI is just more of like a scaffolding tool than actual using it to create an Angular app. Any more questions before I move on? Okay, let's talk about what is next for Angular. The Angular team is currently working on the third render engine Ivy, which is using two major concepts. It uses tree shaking, so it removes unused code to result in smaller bundle sizes and faster load speeds. And it has locality, which compiles one file at a time, and it only looks at the component and its templates, but it's not its dependencies. Does anyone have any questions before I move on?
Have you worked with Ivy before?
I haven't, I've kind of messed around with it a little bit, but since it's in its infancy stage, it's not 100% complete, but there are a couple examples out there how to actually get it working on your Angular version 6. So now let's look at some of the demos that I had some of the apps that I've been working on and created. So for this first app, it is just an Angular version 2 app that I haven't updated to version 6 yet. And it is just a simple site that I created for my mom when she was running for town council. So with this app, most of it is just simple HTML, and it has use of the Angular router, so I can access different content. And then for the endorsements, I'm using the Google Firebase as my database, where I can display all the data inside this HTML page. And then I also added a calendar using ng prime for upcoming events or showing what the current day is. And then finally, I added a contact form where it takes a bunch of fields, and then if you were to click submit, it would just send an email to my mom. And then moving on to my last app that I've been working on it's in Angular version 6, and it's an app that I've been using and working with the Spotify API. And so far what I've been able to accomplish is create my own shuffler, because I didn't like the shuffler that Spotify came with, where it only shuffles a certain amount of songs, and if you reach the limit of all those shuffled tracks, you'll eventually go back to the song you started with. So I've created a shuffler where it first removes all the tracks and then just adds them back in the correct order, which might not be the best implementation, but I'm working on another version to use the reorder API call to just replace the order of the tracks themselves. And I was able to create a filter, detect and remove duplicate tracks, where in the Spotify app, if you are adding tracks to a playlist, it only detects if the song or the track is identical to what is already in the playlist. But my filter detects the song duration, the name and the artists, and then it returns with the list of results that are in those order, or fits the criteria. And then finally, I was able to play full-length Spotify tracks in the browser without the app open, using the Spotify's Playback SDK. So first, I'm going to log into Spotify, which would normally pop up with a Spotify window, but in this case, I've already been authenticated. So for the first example, I have a playlist with two tracks that are identical. It has the same name, same title, same artist, and same song duration. So if I click on this check for duplicate songs filter, it filters out just these two tracks. And I'll also show that in the Spotify app itself, that these songs are in this playlist, as you can see. Now if I go back to the website and I click this last song here and then I click remove duplicate, it is now gone from the UI. And if I move back to the Spotify app, it has been deleted. Now I'll look at this other playlist here for songs to shuffle. You can see the order of the songs right here, and as well as in Spotify app. Now if I click the shuffle button here. It's shuffled it on the UI, and it has also shuffled on the app. And as you can see, it was added a few seconds ago because it removed the songs and then re-added them. And then finally, if I go back to this playlist and then I click the play button, it starts playing the song, and then I can also pause the song. So the topics that we covered today was the differences between Angular and AngularJS, what is Angular, the core concepts of Angular, the major changes between version 2 and 6, the lifecycle methods of Angular, a brief overview of TypeScript, a brief overview of RxJS, the configuration of Angular, the Angular CLI, what is next for Angular, and then finally the apps that I've been working on. Does anyone have any other questions?
Yeah.
Are you the reason why all that Drake was showing up in my Spotify?
No.
It's okay if you are.
Yeah. Does anyone have any magic tricks like React does with the virtual DOM when it just replaces the one thing in the page that's changed? Does Angular refresh the whole page? Does it just refresh one piece that's changed?
So I know with
how does it compare to React in that way?
So I know with two-way data binding, it doesn't refresh the entire page. So if you're entering in a name into an input field, it won't just update the string on the
at
UI.
the beginning where you're typing in, or the slide was still typing, and it would show it right away. And all that's so it's a totally different concept than React.
Yeah, because this is two-way data binding, where React is all about one-way data flow.
Okay.
I think the conceptual difference between React versus Angular is that Angular is heavily observable based. So everything is kind of live and in action. So when you make an AJAX request, you're creating an observable that returns a promise that will then give you data. And then when that data comes back, whatever is observing that will update, as opposed to React, which aside from the in-memory virtual DOM, it's basically a reconciler that basically works through your tree and kind of flushes the tree out in the kind of the one-way data flow. So it's functional kind of versus reactive a little bit. So Angular is very observable based. If you've ever heard of products, that's an observable base. That's kind of a complement to like React's one-way data flow. So kind of black box versus very predictable, but maybe a little like more roundabout.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's the observable part that
It's like the cornerstone of the Angular framework, right? It's like built in as like a primitive to the entire thing.
Alright, yeah, that makes sense now.
It is a little tricky to wrap your head around though, so yeah.
Yeah, especially when I've been like head first into React for weeks. Trying to escape out of that
Pros and
mindset.
cons, you know. One kind of wires everything up for you, and the other one you have to do a little bit more of the wiring, but they might argue that it's more predictable that way, you know, which is kind of where Redux fits in. It's like a very predictable funnel of all the actions, as opposed to just more of a pub sub type approach where it's just talking to everybody else.
It's a little good news to make the mind switch.
Yeah, it's kind of like, I feel that sometimes, in my experience, where the comparisons of the two are made, it's, you know, less about the model, more about the syntax, and really the way to get into those frameworks is the mental model, and so you understand like why React is being more verbose, because that was the design decision. Whereas Angular is like, we're looking at it this way. And so yeah, you might be less like it might not make as much sense because you have your observables and your service and your controller is just observing it, so this thing just happens out of nowhere. You have to like instances of your API service, find out how it's working. But yeah, it's they're both great if you are like aware of how they kind of approach the same problem. And so like the input example, you can do that in React and Angular, but very two very different things.
Yeah, I noticed Matt's example with counting the numbers up and down. The component was a lot shorter in this example than I did recently in React. Doing the same thing in class was like,
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times with React, the other mistake that a lot of people, assumption that people might make is that you have to do something like Redux and you have to put all your data into a central place. Sometimes it just makes sense to use so,
yeah.
I think like the one-way data flow with something like Redux is very much should not be considered default. It should only be used like normalized shared app data, and not for like manipulating the input. When that input field gets saved and pushed, it needs to be like shown in the header and like a profile sidebar. Like that's when it goes into the central state. Then you can use central state with Angular and Rx for that reason.
So different tools do the same job.
But based on a different model, whereas React's going to expect a functional one-way data flow, similar solution. Angular is going to be the same kind of like API, but under the hood, it's going to be done with observables. So,
It's going to be fun learning it all over again.
yeah, well, I mean, it was kind of like a big uproar when they unveiled version 2. My take on it was that really the framework fundamentally changed so much from AngularJS to Angular is because JavaScript itself changed like significantly in years. And so to not start a new framework based off those principles, it's different for React and being able to keep up these things. They basically just kept everything to JavaScript. Right. So Angular had a wider footprint, and so when JavaScript changed, like it really kind of cut out the legs from AngularJS, and they were modifying or like they created their own modeling systems for this, just for being able to create features. And, like,
Why don't we come up with another name?
that's what a lot of people. That's what a lot of people ask. I mean, you can definitely see the influences. And so, yeah, I guess it's debatable whether the whole brand name or whatnot. I don't know if it's
I wish it did because it's so confusing.
Yeah.
Separate.
I wonder if you think they kept the name to try to retain some of the previous development, right? If you come up with a new
There's
name,
probably a lot of experience, right?
and we would have completely, well, that's a whole new framework. I don't want to learn that new thing. I'm already using something. But if you keep it as Angular, you say, oh wow, okay. It's technically the same thing, but it's just a little different under the hood. But it's really so different that it was like learning a new framework anyway.
Yeah.
Now, a little personal thing about me, I used AngularJS for about 4 years and was an expert in it from top to bottom. And I've never used Angular. Never. I've never used Angular 2+.
Is it deprecated? AngularJS?
Not necessarily deprecated. It's in that golden era, where, in my opinion, where you have companies that don't want to invest in redoing everything, right?
Yeah.
If you spent 4 years building your flagship product and you don't have the manpower to completely rebuild it, you see that with financial institutions a lot, where they're still using 25-year-old software because nobody wants to pay to fix it.
I know. I'm still using jQuery.
Well, there you go, right? That's really what it is.
basically syntactic. You mentioned earlier that this linting capabilities. So what tools are there to prevent simple syntax errors before runtime to your overall Angular component setup?
Well, I know that Angular comes with TSLint, which is just TypeScript linting. So it will, right at compile time, it will tell you what is wrong syntactically. And then and TypeScript also helps to like review, avoid bugs, where if you have one variable and you're starting off with a string.
The question really is about, so it looks like Angular is on top of TypeScript. And it has this expectation of like the root, for example, the provided by, is that what it was?
Oh, provided for injectable services.
It had a root, so it's a string there that TypeScript would say, yeah, it's perfectly fine if you use root with 3 O's instead of 2. But Angular wouldn't like that. And so I'm wondering if there's any linting at the Angular level.
I don't believe that there is.
Well, Angular is written in TypeScript. The entire framework is using
But
TypeScript.
it's all interpreted, so it's, it only happens at runtime.
So TypeScript, when TypeScript is a superset of JavaScript, everything in TypeScript is that you write on TypeScript minus like the new interface keyword, all that stuff is still JavaScript. And so the build process is such that Webpack, which is the module bundler, when it encounters a TypeScript file, whatever is in it, it could be Angular, it could just be just regular, like a regular class, will Webpack, when it sees that file needs to be processed, it will, based on the configuration, in this case, I think it's like TS loader, will call out to the TypeScript compiler itself and run through all that code. And if your types mismatch, like you have if it fails printing errors, you'll get that in the terminal. Your browser will not refresh until the errors in your terminal go away. And then so the idea is that you try and front load all these runtime mishaps where you should have passed a string, but it takes an object or the response was a string, and you thought it was deleted, and now you got like.
Yeah, no, I understand that part. For example, if you have a template that's expecting so you have double curly braces, and you're using a term in there that doesn't actually exist anywhere in your data model, you won't discover that, I think, until you see a rendered name.
I mean, your backend, like you could say my backend response is going to be an array of these user interface objects, but someone could swap out the whole backend on you overnight, and now you get, not that response. Yeah, your app will still crash, even though you're.
Well, yeah,
So it's not 100%.
No, that's fine.
It is still susceptible to a number of runtime occurrences that happen. I think the argument that the TypeScript team would make is that this is really about trying to fill in the gaps for JavaScript at a larger scale, where this idea of the user object is going to be shared through multiple components and multiple views. And so the idea is that everything revolves around this user interface object. You change the interfaces that you will immediately get the 20 other files that are now printing. So you don't have to go and check 20 pages to make sure that they all are using the right version of that user interface so it's get it right away. So it's kind of more of an at scale thing. It's really targeted, or I think returns its value best when you have a larger application with a lot of different entities that reflect your particular domain. And so you're using that to keep your profile badge and your header
heavily typed system, the more you use the type system correctly,
Exactly.
the more helpful
Yep. Yep.
outcome errors.
Yeah, exactly.
And sometimes it's in demos, particularly small demos, you see kind of the crafty stuff that's it's crafty, but you only have to deal with it once. And then the really big problems, there's really good support for.
Yeah.
So my looking at the provided in and seeing this string saying root, that had special meaning, was just one of those crafty things.
It's more an insurance policy on yourself as a developer, more or less, not necessarily like you're going to have 100% run. This isn't like necessarily a guarantee on 100% runtime error-free code. It's more of a, it shines a lot more in like refactoring scenarios and stuff like that. It's not like as you're developing it, you probably won't see the value until you need to make a refactor, and then you have to define the 20 instances of where you're changing this thing.
Right.
You're just running your building. There it is. So,
Thank you. Thanks.
but yeah, it's cool stuff. It definitely adds, in all fairness, it adds a level of complexity. But as Matt pointed out, the CLI is really that shortcut. You just start working and start typing, and when you need something more, you'll know that the CLI will take care of all the things that you need.
Right, thank you, Owen. Does anyone else have any more questions?
I love you, Matt.
As far as upgrading versions, have you done upgrades according to the 4, 4 to 6, 4 to 5?
I believe I did 4 to 5, and I know there is, normally when they come out with the next major release, they come out with documentation on how to upgrade your app to the next version. And then all the steps on how to do that.
Has that been a pretty smooth process?
Overall, it's pretty smooth, but it also depends on some of the things that change, where if your app is like really, really big, it could take more time than if it's a smaller app. But most of the time, it's a pretty smooth process.
So I think we remember like when Angular 2 first came out, there was one way to get it done by default, and it's optional. Am I remembering that correctly? If so, is it optional?
I'm not 100% sure about the one-way data binding, but I know two-way data binding is like a pretty big thing in Angular. 2x, sorry.
They did have that. I know they had an AngularJS that you had to play around with, where if you put the semicolon. Oh yeah. If you knew that this particular. So one of the main issues with AngularJS that really kind of caught people off guard at scale was because of the implementation of two-way data binding, the app was always actively like observing pieces of state, which meant that like every time you use those curly braces, you had a washer, they would call it. But if you were like say rendering a list that wasn't part of live data, or you knew that you didn't need two-way data binding, you could use special syntax to only roll one way and try and cut down on your.
Was it using like set timeouts along there?
I think that was the underlying change detection system was. It was dirty checking, so it was basically more or less. I'm not sure if it was that, but it was along the lines of like, I think when an event was triggered, it would do a bunch of checks to see like the value was. It was very like.
I know with you use ES6 getters and setters.
Yep. Yeah. But that was like one of the big things that they did in Angular was they went all observable based and basically using browser primitives to do change detection now. Regardless of the force where they're getting is. As much as they like that's not like which is all change detection.
Any other questions?